Rome did not conquer the ancient world simply because its soldiers were stronger. It conquered because Roman commanders understood something their enemies often learned too late. A battle could be won before the first sword was drawn. When arrows darkened the sky, Roman soldiers could lock their shields together and become a moving fortress. When Carthage dominated the sea, Rome found a way to turn naval combat into a land battle. When war elephants thundered toward their lines, the Romans learned not to stop them, but to guide them through carefully opened gaps. And when Julius Caesar found himself trapped between an enemy fortress and a massive relief army, he answered with something almost unbelievable. He built another wall. These were not desperate tricks. They were the result of discipline, engineering, adaptation, and a willingness to change the rules of war. But perhaps the most terrifying Roman tactic was not designed for an enemy at all. It was used against Rome's own soldiers. Today, we're uncovering some of the most shocking battle tactics ever used by the Roman army, and how they helped turn Rome into one of history's most feared military powers. Imagine advancing toward an enemy fortress while hundreds of arrows fall from above. For most ancient armies, crossing that open ground could become a massacre. The Romans had another answer: Testudo, the famous tortoise formation. At a command, legionaries closed the gaps between them and locked their shields into a protective shell. The men at the front held their shields forward. Soldiers along the sides protected the flanks, while those inside raised their shields overhead. From a distance, the formation looked less like a group of individual soldiers and more like a single armored creature crawling toward the enemy. Its greatest value appeared during sieges. Roman troops often had to approach walls while defenders fired arrows, threw spears, or dropped stones from above. The testudo gave them a moving roof and wall of shields, allowing the unit to continue advancing under heavy missile fire. To defenders watching from the ramparts, the effect could be deeply intimidating. They could keep shooting, yet the Roman formation continued moving closer. But the testudo was not invincible. Its strength depended on discipline and coordination. The formation moved slowly, and the soldiers had limited ability to fight while keeping their shields locked in position. If enemies reached them at close range, attacked from several directions, or disrupted the formation at the right moment, its protective shell could collapse. That was the real power of the testudo. It was not simply a defensive formation. It showed how Rome could turn individual soldiers into parts of a larger machine. But defense alone could not win a battle. Rome also needed a system that could keep fresh troops fighting while the enemy slowly exhausted itself. That system was the Roman triple line, a formation designed not simply to hit the enemy once, but to keep pressure on them as the battle continued. Picture an opposing army after hours of fighting. Its soldiers are tired, formations are beginning to loosen, and commanders are struggling to maintain control. Then they look across the battlefield and realize that the Romans still have organized troops waiting behind the men already fighting. In the traditional Roman system, the hastati formed the first main line. They were generally younger soldiers and were expected to absorb the opening pressure of the battle. Behind them stood the principes, more experienced troops ready to continue the fight if the first line failed to break the enemy. At the rear waited the triarii, seasoned veterans who represented the final reserve. Before the main clash, lighter troops could move forward to harass the enemy with missiles, and then withdraw through gaps in the Roman formation. Those gaps were essential. They allowed units to advance, retreat, and reorganize without turning the entire army into a confused mass. This created a terrifying problem for Rome's enemies. Breaking the first Roman line did not necessarily mean victory. Exhausted soldiers could suddenly find themselves facing another organized force that had not yet spent its strength. If the situation became desperate, the veterans of the final line could still enter the battle. The Romans even developed a saying for such moments: matters had come to the triarii, meaning the situation had reached a critical stage. The real weapon was not simply 3 rows of soldiers. It was controlled rotation, reserves, and discipline. Rome could absorb pressure without immediately collapsing. But sometimes commanders did not want to slowly exhaust an enemy line. Sometimes they needed to tear it open. For that, the Romans could turn their formation into a human wedge. Instead of spreading their strength evenly across the battlefield, soldiers formed a compact triangle, narrow at the front and wider toward the rear. The men at the point had the most dangerous job. They were expected to strike the enemy line first, while the ranks behind them pressed forward and added weight to the attack. The idea was brutally simple. A straight battle line distributes pressure across a wide area. A wedge concentrates that pressure on one small section. Like a metal wedge driven into wood, the formation was intended to create a crack and force it wider. Once the front of the enemy formation began to break, Roman soldiers could push into the opening. The sides of the wedge widened the gap, separating enemy units that had previously been fighting shoulder to shoulder. A solid defensive line could suddenly become 2 disconnected groups. That was when confusion became as dangerous as Roman swords. Soldiers near the breach had to decide whether to close the gap, retreat, or turn toward the Romans pouring through it. Orders became harder to hear. Units lost contact with one another. What had looked like a stable formation moments earlier could begin collapsing from the center. The original account points to battles such as Pydna and Watling Street to illustrate how concentrated Roman attacks could help disrupt enemy formations. The important principle was not the triangle itself, but what it achieved: precision instead of simple mass. Rome did not always need to overpower an entire army at once. Sometimes it only needed to break one critical point and let panic do the rest. On land, this kind of disciplined infantry warfare gave Rome an enormous advantage. But during the First Punic War, Rome faced an opponent whose greatest strength was somewhere Roman legionaries could not simply march: the sea. Carthage knew how to fight there. Rome would have to change the rules. Carthage knew how to fight there. Rome would have to change the rules. At the beginning of the First Punic War, Carthage possessed something Rome could not easily match: generations of naval experience. Carthaginian crews understood maneuvering, speed, and the violent rhythm of combat at sea. Roman strength, however, was built around disciplined infantry fighting on solid ground. So Rome developed a solution that was as direct as it was strange. The Corvus was a heavy wooden boarding bridge mounted on a Roman warship. At its end was a large iron spike. When an enemy vessel came close enough, the bridge could be dropped onto its deck. The spike slammed down, helping lock the ships together. In that instant, the nature of the battle changed. The Carthaginian ship could no longer rely as easily on speed or maneuverability. Roman soldiers crossed the bridge carrying shields and weapons, turning the enemy deck into something much more familiar: a battlefield for infantry. This was the genius of the Corvus. Rome did not suddenly become better than Carthage at traditional naval warfare. Instead, it found a way to reduce the importance of Carthage's greatest advantage. The tactic proved valuable in major early Roman naval victories. At Mylae in 260 BC, Roman forces used boarding tactics to capture Carthaginian ships and secure a major success at sea. The same basic concept appeared again as Rome continued challenging Carthaginian naval power. But the Corvus came with serious limitations. The device was heavy, made ships more difficult to handle, and was poorly suited to rough conditions. As Roman naval experience improved, it eventually became less necessary. Yet its importance went beyond the weapon itself. The Corvus revealed a pattern that would appear repeatedly in Roman warfare. When Rome could not defeat an enemy on the enemy's terms, it looked for a way to change those terms. But clever battlefield psychology could change the rules too. Sometimes an army could appear to lose and use that apparent defeat to lead its enemy directly into a trap. Sometimes an army could appear to lose and use that apparent defeat to lead its enemy directly into a trap. The feigned retreat was one of warfare's most dangerous psychological tricks. On the surface, it looked simple. Soldiers turned away from the enemy and began to flee. The opposing force saw panic, weakness, and the sudden possibility of an easy victory. That was exactly what the retreating army wanted them to see. The real target was not the enemy's body. It was their discipline. Once soldiers believed their opponents were broken, they could abandon formation and rush forward in pursuit. Units became stretched across the battlefield. Officers struggled to keep men together. The faster the chase continued, the more organized strength could turn into a scattered crowd. Then the retreat stopped. The fleeing troops could suddenly turn and attack, or the pursuing soldiers could discover that they had been drawn toward another force waiting in ambush. The Romans understood how dangerous this deception could be, partly because they sometimes suffered from it themselves. During the First Punic War, the Carthaginian commander Hanno reportedly used Numidian cavalry to lure Roman forces forward before striking back. Similar tricks were used by Rome's enemies in later conflicts, including forces fighting Roman armies in Hispania. That is what made the tactic so effective. It transformed confidence into vulnerability. The enemy did not need to be physically forced out of position. They could be persuaded to leave it voluntarily. But a feigned retreat required enormous control. Soldiers had to run without truly panicking, maintain enough organization to turn back, and trust that the rest of the plan would work. A fake retreat could become a real disaster if discipline collapsed. Rome learned repeatedly that intelligence on the battlefield could be just as dangerous as weapons. And nowhere was adaptation more important than when Roman soldiers faced something far more terrifying than cavalry or infantry: a charging war elephant. A charging war elephant could make even experienced soldiers question whether any formation could hold. To an infantryman, the animal was a moving wall of muscle. Its size could terrify horses. Its momentum could smash into tightly packed troops, and the psychological effect alone could weaken a battle line before contact. Rome encountered elephants in major wars against enemies such as Pyrrhus and Carthage, and the early experiences were frightening. But the Romans adapted. Instead of always trying to stop elephants head-on, Roman commanders learned to reduce the impact of the charge. One solution was to create gaps or lanes in the formation. If the elephants continued forward, they could be guided through these open spaces rather than crashing directly into dense ranks of soldiers. Once the animals passed through, they became more vulnerable. Roman troops could attack from the sides, using missiles and spears while avoiding the most dangerous part of the charge. Obstacles, trenches, and other defensive measures could also disrupt their movement. The most famous example came at Zama in 202 BC. Hannibal opened the battle with a large elephant attack, but Scipio's army had prepared lanes through its formation. Roman light troops harassed the animals, while many were directed through the gaps. Some became confused or turned away, reducing the devastating impact Hannibal hoped to achieve. Ancient accounts also describe more unusual attempts to frighten elephants, including the use of pigs and fire. Whether every dramatic version of these stories happened exactly as later writers described is uncertain, but the principle behind them was clear. Elephants were powerful weapons, yet they were still animals capable of panic. That was Rome's advantage. Something terrifying did not remain mysterious forever. Roman commanders observed it, survived it, and searched for weaknesses. But Rome's most astonishing use of adaptation did not involve an animal. It involved miles of trenches, walls, towers, traps, and Julius Caesar deliberately placing his army between two enemy forces. It involved miles of trenches, walls, towers, traps, and Julius Caesar deliberately placing his army between two enemy forces. In 52 BC, the Gallic leader Vercingetorix withdrew into the fortified stronghold of Alesia. A direct assault would have been costly, so Caesar chose a different weapon: engineering. His legions began constructing a massive ring of fortifications around the position, cutting the defenders off from escape and outside supplies. The Roman works included trenches, ramparts, towers, stakes, and concealed obstacles. Instead of repeatedly throwing soldiers against the defenses, Caesar intended to turn time itself into a weapon. Then the situation became far more dangerous. Before the encirclement was complete, Gallic cavalry had escaped and called for reinforcements. A large relief army was coming. Caesar now faced a nightmare. Vercingetorix and his warriors were inside Alesia, while another enemy force would soon attack from outside. Most armies would have been forced to abandon the siege. Caesar built another wall. The Romans constructed a second defensive line facing outward. The first ring kept the besieged Gauls trapped inside. The second protected the Romans from the relief army. Caesar had effectively placed his legions inside a fortified corridor between two hostile forces. When the relief army arrived, the Romans were attacked from both directions. The Gauls inside attempted to break out while their allies assaulted the outer defenses. At critical points, Roman positions came under enormous pressure. But the system held. Roman engineering, reserves, fortifications, and disciplined counterattacks eventually defeated the attempts to break the siege. Vercingetorix surrendered, and Alesia became one of Caesar's most famous victories. The brilliance was not simply that Caesar built walls. It was that he recognized the danger of being surrounded and transformed that danger into a defensive system designed for exactly that situation. Yet walls and clever formations only worked if soldiers obeyed orders under extreme pressure. And Rome had a terrifying method for dealing with those who did not. It was called decimation, one of the harshest punishments associated with Roman military discipline. Unlike the formations and battlefield tricks used against foreign armies, this weapon was aimed inward at Roman soldiers themselves. Decimation was reserved for extreme failures such as mutiny, desertion, or cowardice. A disgraced unit could be divided into groups of 10. Lots were drawn, and one man from each group was selected. The others were then forced to participate in killing him. The punishment did not end there. Survivors could receive reduced rations, sometimes barley instead of the normal wheat allowance, and could be forced to sleep outside the protection of the Roman camp. The message was impossible to misunderstand. A Roman soldier who abandoned his duty did not only risk death at the hands of the enemy. He could face punishment from his own army. One of the most famous examples is associated with Marcus Licinius Crassus during the war against Spartacus. After Roman forces suffered humiliating failures, Crassus used severe discipline to restore order and make retreat more frightening than standing in battle. Decimation was not an everyday Roman practice. Its rarity was part of what made it so terrifying. When commanders used it, the punishment demonstrated how far Roman authority could go to enforce obedience. That helps explain the deeper strength behind everything we have seen. Testudo required men to hold formation. The triple line required controlled movement. Caesar's fortifications at Alesia required soldiers to defend their positions under pressure from two directions. Roman tactics depended on discipline. And sometimes, Rome maintained that discipline through fear. Rome's military power was never built around a single secret weapon. The Testudo could protect soldiers beneath a wall of shields. The triple line could keep fresh troops entering the fight. The wedge could concentrate force at one vulnerable point. The Corvus could transform a naval battle into an infantry fight. Roman commanders learned to respond to war elephants, while Caesar at Alesia turned engineering into a weapon on an extraordinary scale. And behind all of it stood something less visible: discipline. That may be the most important reason Roman tactics were so effective. A formation only works when soldiers remain in position. A complex maneuver only works when thousands of men respond to commands under pressure. Fortifications only matter when exhausted troops continue defending them. Rome was dangerous because it adapted. When an enemy presented a new problem, Roman commanders looked for a weakness. When the battlefield changed, they changed with it. And when the normal rules of war worked against them, they searched for a way to rewrite those rules entirely. That combination of engineering, organization, psychology, and ruthless discipline helped turn Roman armies into one of the ancient world's most feared military forces. But which Roman tactic surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments below. And if you enjoyed exploring the strategy, ingenuity, and brutality behind Roman warfare, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story from the battlefields of history.